in association with Combat Sport Collective, clothing for those who love combat sports. You're listening to Straight to the Point, Uncut. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Straight to the Point, Uncut. I'm your host, Kieran Gibbons. You can like the podcast on Twitter at STTP Uncut. You can like our Facebook page, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. All the episodes are available for download from all the usual podcast sites. And you can also watch all the interviews and episodes via our YouTube channel. Today's a special episode. This is only going to be available on the YouTube channel because this is to do with current affairs. This is stuff that's happening now. I'm very pleased to be joined by former London firefighter Lucy MASOUD, who for a number of years has been involved in fighting for the rights of Palestinian people. Lucy's been to Palestine a number of times and been involved in a number of campaigns to help Palestinians. And I thought Lucy would be a great person to ask about the ongoing situation in Jerusalem at the moment. So Lucy, terrible scenes on the news. I mean, it's got to be pretty terrible for the British news to cover anything about Palestine because they just normally ignore it. So what's your take on things? And just tell people, perhaps the man in the street or the woman in the street who perhaps doesn't follow these events too closely, what's happening out there at the moment and why the violence is taking place.
Well, there's a number of reasons, really, and it is very concerning what's coming out of occupied Jerusalem at the moment. So you've got the one issue where you have part of occupied Jerusalem that is a Palestinian area, it's a Palestinian town. And the Israelis have essentially said that all the occupants of that particular town will be evicted. I need to bear in mind that, you know, even international law says that that particular part of Jerusalem is Palestinian, and the jurisdiction of that land comes under Palestine. Yet the Israelis have decided that they're going to evict those occupants of that town and essentially turn it into a Jewish settlement. Last I heard was that the order to illegally evict those Palestinians from their homes where they've lived for generations upon generations, that the decision to evict those had been put on hold for about a week or so. But let's be under no illusion that the Israeli government are fully intending to illegally evict those Palestinians from their homes that they own, homes that their family have owned, grandparents have owned, that they will illegally kick them out and hand that land over to Israeli settlers. And that will be the end of that. That will just become another part of Israel. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of tension in that area at the moment. The occupants are demonstrating, people from across Palestine. Some Israelis as well, I'm sure, are joining in protests against that eviction taking place. At the same time, you have various sort of nationalist holidays going on at the moment in Israel. So you have quite extreme settlers marching through Arab neighborhoods, calling for deaths to Arabs, just making a nuisance of themselves, setting things alight, vandalizing, attacking Arabs. And what you've also seen in the last few days, which is what you've seen a chip of on the TV, on the news, is that the Israeli military have been invading Al-Aqsa Mosque and letting off smoke bombs and firing steel-coated rubber bullets at worshippers in there. Obviously, bear in mind, it's the holy month of Ramadan at the moment, so you will have Palestinians who will be fasting throughout the day and then will go to the mosque in the evening to pray. And whilst they're in this mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, the Israeli soldiers are continually invading this mosque and harassing these people, shooting at these people, intimidating these people, and just treating them absolutely appallingly. Just before I joined this podcast, someone brought to my attention a clip in Gaza where they rocketed a town in Gaza, and a number of people, including children, unfortunately were killed by the Israeli military. So it's, I mean, you know as well as me, this has been ongoing for for such a long time. Although tensions are particularly high at the moment, and it's making the news in the UK, this isn't something out of the blue. This isn't a one-off. This happens day in and day out in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in parts of occupied Jerusalem as well, and throughout, if you want to call it Israel, throughout Israel as well. So yes, things are particularly bad now, and it is making the news. I notice how they're portraying it on the news in this country. It's very much, you know, clashes between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and tensions are high. It's like, well, there's not clashes. There's a government imposing brutality on an occupied population. Nothing clashy about that. It's, you know, it's has the potential to turn into genocide. It's already an apartheid system that is just getting worse and worse and worse. And unfortunately, the people who suffer are the Palestinians.
And I think it's, you made a really good point at the start there when you described Jerusalem as occupied Jerusalem, because a lot of people don't even realize that the Palestinians, the eastern part of Jerusalem was always meant to be their capital, and it was taken off them in 1967.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that almost is, I think the Israeli government in the early 80s, maybe 1980, passed a law basically claiming the whole of Jerusalem for themselves, in effect taking it off any negotiation table for the future.
Well, it's been a political hot potato, so to speak, for, you know, a very long time, with the Israeli government, successive Israeli governments wanting to make Jerusalem their capital. Currently, it's Tel Aviv. And of course, when we had Trump as president, he was the only president really to give them the green card to do that. Previous presidents had always kind of teased the Israelis that they would support them in doing so, because there's no way Israel could do that, could move their capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem without the backing of America. And although you've had some quite right-wing conservative presidents such as George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., who have indicated to the Israelis that they would support them doing that, actually, when they became president, they took a step back and never did support them and never did allow them to do that. It was only when Trump was elected, and I strongly suspect it has to do with his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's a very kind of militant, sort of pro-Israel. It's only when that happened that the green light was given for them to move their capital. That's against all international law, as we've discussed. That part of Jerusalem is Palestinian by international law. There's no ifs or buts about it. It is Palestine. It's part of Palestine. But of course, it's in the Israelis' interests if they can just keep pushing and pushing the Arabs out of the city and just expanding their borders. They already occupy the West Bank. Again, the West Bank is part of Palestine, but you can't really have a sovereign country when it's occupied by another force. And that's what you have in the West Bank. You have very small pockets of Palestine that aren't occupied by the Israelis, where they have no influence at all, very small pockets. I spent quite a lot of time in Hebron, or as we call it, El Khalil, and again, occupied. Lots of settlers there. Actually, I lie, a very small number of settlers there, but a huge number of soldiers there, Israeli soldiers protecting those settlers. Now, those soldiers aren't peacekeepers. They're not there to protect the Palestinians and the settlers and to keep them apart and to keep them both safe. They're there purely to protect the settlers and to allow the settlers to do whatever they want to the Palestinians, which they do on a daily basis. They attack the Palestinians, they try and drive them off the roads, they shoot at the Palestinians, they attack the children when the children are going to school. Something I did when I was there was, we used to call it the school run, which is we'd have to get up. So myself and other volunteers would get up early in the morning and walk the children to school. And as we were walking the children to school, guaranteed, we would get attacked by these extreme Israeli settlers. And if we weren't getting attacked by the Israeli settlers, we were getting tear gassed by the Israeli soldiers. And of course, it's within their interest that they keep the situation in Hebron extremely tense, extremely volatile, because it justifies their continued occupation. If Hebron was a peaceful place and there was no kickoffs and there was no tension, then the international community would say, well, why does it need to be occupied? What Israel does is it goes in there, it causes strife and it causes conflict every single day in order to justify them keeping troops in part of Palestine.
And I think as well in Hebron, I'm right in saying that there was a massacre in the mid-90s where an American Jew he attacked Muslims worshipping in the mosque.
Yeah,
and actually in response to that, the Israeli government made restrictions more difficult on the Palestinians. And actually the Palestinians' more rights was taken off them as a result of that massacre.
Yeah, I think it was the Ibrahimi Mosque. And I've actually been in there, and the Ibrahimi Mosque sort of backs on to I think it's the tomb of Abraham. I think I'm not sure.
I think it is. Yeah.
And I think it was Dr. Gold. He was a doctor, the guy who went into the mosque and massacred about 30 or so Palestinians. So he did that, obviously very fanatical. And in response to that, what the Israelis did is they shut down one of the main roads that was by the mosque and evicted all the Palestinians from there and made that a no-go zone for Palestinians. So now there's no Palestinians who live in there. The few Palestinians who still have properties in there can't even come out of the front entrance because it's on that street, Shahada Street. They've got to crawl through windows and come out of a different way. Palestinians aren't allowed to walk down that road, but Jewish settlers are, Israeli soldiers are, foreigners are. So that's pure apartheid. There's no other word for it when you're not allowing one group of people based on their nationality or their race to walk on a certain road or a certain street, but you're allowing other people to. That's apartheid. And that's what you have in Palestine.
Yeah, and just going back to the situation in Jerusalem that's ongoing at the moment, what's the Israeli justification for evicting these Palestinians, as far as you understand?
I mean, they tend to make it up as they go along. I'm sure there's some bit of law somewhere that they found that, you know, somehow gives ownership of this particular town to the Israeli settlers. Who knows? You know, Benjamin Netanyahu, he always has to appeal to because they have proportional representation over there. Very complicated system. And I know there's a lot of people who think we should have proportional representation in this country. I always say, look at Israel. That's a perfect example why we shouldn't have it, because you have to appeal to the real kind of extremes on each side. And this is what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing. So I believe he's in the middle of trying to form a coalition government. So no doubt this will be something that he is able to show his sort of right-wing credentials, his pro-Israel credentials. But, you know, for sure, they would have dug up some nonsense that somehow gave them ownership of this land. Quite a few times when I would stay in Jerusalem, and as much as I could, I would always avoid being in Israel. But to get to Palestine, you have to fly into Tel Aviv. And when I would fly into Tel Aviv, in order for me to get to Hebron or wherever I was going, sometimes I would get to Tel Aviv quite late. And because I would always be kept by Israeli security in the airport because of my surname, I would be there for sort of 6-7 hours being questioned. And when I eventually came out of the airport, it would be like midnight. It would be too late to go to Palestine. So I'd end up having to stay in Jerusalem. And I'd always sort of stay on the east part. And there was a hotel I used to stay in, gorgeous hotel, Palestinian run, been there for about 100 years, absolutely gorgeous hotel. I think it's called the Imperial. And since, I think it was about a year ago, 2 years ago, someone came up with some bit of paper that proved that this hotel didn't belong to these Palestinians or something to do with something. I think it was rented and they they essentially just managed to take the hotel away from the Palestinian and turn it over to Israeli ownership. And that's just very typical of what happens in Palestine, in Israel. They often confiscate land from Palestinians in the West Bank. And I think there's a law that if a piece of land is confiscated for a certain amount of time and not utilized, then you relinquish ownership. Well, if the government have confiscated land from its owner and not allowing that owner to use that land, of course, it's not going to be utilized for however long it's confiscated for. And what the Israelis do is they confiscate it for the required amount of time, whatever it is, 2 years, 5 years. And then after that time, then the owner doesn't own it anymore. And it can be handed over to the Israeli government, who will probably hand it over to Israeli settlers.
What do you think needs to happen on a political level for some sort of just peace deal for the Palestinians?
I mean, with America, with Israel, what we know is that they don't really listen to anyone apart from the Americans. So ultimately, it's on the Americans. This country, yes, we've got a conservative government who are never really going to do much about Israel. To be fair to them, our Labour government didn't really do much towards putting pressure on Israel. But certainly in this country, we have grassroots campaigning going on. We've always been supportive of Palestine in this country, I believe, generally. And that can be seen, I think, across the world, probably in America as well, as the kind of threat from Iran lessens in America, because it was always very much heightened in the 80s, where the Iranians were seen as this massive threat, and people associated Iran with supporters of Palestine and vice versa. So, they naturally took an anti-Iran, which led to an anti-Palestinian stance. But I think as that's dissipating, and people aren't old enough to really remember those tensions in the early 80s, people are seeing for themselves that what's going on in Israel is not right. But ultimately, it's down to the government of the US to put pressure on the Israelis to cut their funding, to essentially threaten them. But I can't see it happening. I can't see it happening with Biden at all. We had the vice president on TV yesterday talking about how proud she was to be in Israel a few years ago to plant some trees. This is not an administration that is going to be friends to the Palestinians. I forgot her name now. The senator, they know her by her initials. I can't remember her name.
Not sure.
I'll have to Google it.
Well, anyway.
Well, she was in this documentary called Bringing Down the House, or Taking the House, when she got elected to the Senate. And she was brilliant. She was this young woman who was very passionate, and they showed clips of her talking passionately about Palestine. She's a Democrat, talking passionately about Palestine, and how you needed to, take on Israel and cut the funding, all the rest of it. Of course, now the Democrats are in power. She's had a complete U-turn on her position. And it's so sad to see, but it's so typical. It's absolutely so typical.
I noticed, if you remember back to 2016 or 15, whenever it was, when Donald Trump was trying to get the Republican Party nomination, the question of they had all the potential candidates there, and the question of Israel and Palestine came up, and Donald Trump more or less said, "Well, we got to deal with this even-handedly," and he was very very critical of the American approach, and then he obviously got heavily criticized for that. But by the next presidential debate, or the candidates debate, he done a complete U-turn and was fully on board the pro-Israel train, so to speak. So obviously somebody had a word with him in between those two debates and said, "No, it's in your interest to be supporting the Israelis."
Yeah, and I do recall that when he first came out. I remember, I think I might put it on social media going, "Ugh, he's hideous," but actually, this is quite promising what he's saying. And then very quickly, his position changed. As I say, I suspect a lot of that may have to do with his son-in-law. His son-in-law is quite fundamentalist in what he believes about Israel. And I'd imagine he was also trying to appeal to his very right-wing voters, who are traditionally very, very pro-Israel, various reasons. I think it's the religious aspect as well.
I think it's the evangelical Christians. They believe that it's the Jews have to be in charge of Jerusalem for the second coming of Jesus, and then ironically, the Jews have to either convert to Christianity or they'll burn in hell. So, so they're not doing it for the benefit of the Jews. They're actually doing it for the benefit of the second coming of Jesus.
But you know what? To be fair to Donald Trump, he's not any different to any other American president. I know Obama, towards the end of his second term, was more critical, and I think there was some vote at the UN or something where they abstained instead of voting for Israel, or there was something going through the UN and everyone was voting for it. It was anti-Israel. It was like a condemnation of Israel, and everyone voted for it. And traditionally, the US would veto it, vote against it, and they actually abstained, which was massive. But that was right at the end of his second term. So yeah, I'm not expecting any surprises coming out of this administration. They're certainly not giving any signs that they're going to be pro-Israel, pro-Palestine. They haven't. I've not even seen anything where they've come out and condemned what's going on. They haven't in this country either. A few politicians have, and as much as it's easy for us to be critical of the US, we also have to look closer to home at our government. And I'm a member of the Labour Party. I look at the Labour Party and see what a mass influence that Labour Friends of Israel have on the Labour Party compared to Labour Friends of Palestine, which I've had, brief dealings with, but the influence is it's almost laughable. You've got like 3 or 4 MPs who are Labour Friends of Palestine versus your Mandelsons, your Tony Blairs, your all the top hitters have all at some stage been involved or members of Labour Friends of Israel.
There really does seem a fear from people of being pro-Palestinian, and a real fear of any criticism of Israel, because you sometimes see politicians speak out and then almost within 24 hours they're doing a U-turn and then they're backtracking.
Yeah, it's strange in this country because in my experience, by far the population of this country is on the side of the Palestinians. I'm not saying it's something that they think about all the time and they're up on the streets and everything, but I think if you speak to most people about the situation there, they would probably agree that how the Palestinians are being treated is unfair. Things need to change, and that most of Palestine is occupied, and and I would say it's an apartheid state. Whether people would agree with me, I don't know. But then yes, you do get politicians who tend to backtrack. Whether that's for fear of being accused of being anti-Semitic, I don't know. Obviously, during Corbyn's time, there was an element of the party who were very successful in equating any kind of support for Palestine with anti-Semitism. And of course, there was anti-Semitism in the Labour Party for sure, but there was also a lot of genuine criticism against Israel that wasn't anti-Semitic. And I think some people are just very wary to just keep away from it altogether. And I imagine there's probably a stern talking to from the leadership of the Labour Party to MPs to say, don't even go there, don't touch it, let's draw a line. Keir Starmer's been utterly useless on Palestine. That's not surprising. Utterly useless on most things, to be honest. But we don't expect him to have a backbone on this. So it's not something that I would think, okay, things are gonna. We have a Labour Party who will do the right thing and step up. We don't have a Labour Party who will do the right thing and step up. We have to rely on certain individual politicians who will do it. And there's some on the other side as well. I'm sure there's some in the Conservative Party who will talk up, and some in that other Lib Dem group. Got what you said about laughing. But yes, certainly in the Labour Party there are some decent politicians who will speak out about it, but that will be against the party grain.
Have you suffered professionally because of your support of the Palestinians, or did you get any abuse or anything, or any trouble or any hassle?
Not really. I say not really, but thinking about it, I did actually. So when I was firefighter, so when I was in the fire brigade, I had various people contacting the brigade, trying to get me sacked. Just after the Grenfell Tower disaster, I did a lot of media for my union because I was an elected union official. I did lots of media, lots of interviews, and I'd be wearing my FBU t-shirt and I'd have my little Palestinian pins. You know, that's where it is. I always had it, didn't really think much of it. And people would see the pin on TV. You know, I remember once, the day after Grenfell, being interviewed by Sky News, and I was standing right outside the tower. The tower was still smoking. And they interviewed me and I gave my thoughts on what had just happened, had my little Palestinian pin. And then the next day found out that a number of people, including someone from France, had complained to the fire brigade about my Palestinian pin. And my thoughts were, I've just given an interview about 72 men, women and children burning to death in their beds. Now, bearing in mind, we didn't know it was 72 then, but it was evident that a lot of people had died. Yeah. But I've just given an interview about a lot of people dying in their beds. And the only thing you're worried about is my pin on my t-shirt. Kind of shows the mentality. Previous to that, during the war in Gaza a few years before, which really, I'd always been interested in Palestine. I'd always been passionate about it. But the war in Gaza really kind of tipped me over the edge. And that's what made me travel to Palestine the first time. But during that time, I was very vocal on social media. And I got pulled in by the assistant, well, he wasn't at the time, but he ended up being the assistant commissioner of the fire brigade, having a quiet word with me saying, look, rein it in, you know, rein it in, because this isn't going to work out well for you. And in a way, it's terrible. In a way, it's good that he was good enough to have a quiet word for me, like letting me know that eyes were on me and people were kind of circling, waiting for me to trip up and say something that could be perceived as a bit, you know, close to the edge. But the fact was that he still had to pull me in and tell me to rein my neck, you know, wind my neck in. And I did for about 3 minutes and then, you know, carried on with it. So yeah, in that respect, for sure.
It does seem that if you criticize Israel at all, that there's a bit of a consensus across the world from Zionists and similar organizations just to go on full out attack and don't worry about the facts, even if the facts are wrong, or even if you're only saying half truths about people, or sometimes blatant lies. It just seems all out attack is their policy.
I mean, you find that in a lot of debates, where the other side are losing the argument or don't have an argument. That's the tactic that they tend to veer to. Just, you know, scream anti-Semite at you, scream whatever, just accuse you, try and shut you down, try and cancel you. That happens in a lot of debates, and I know you know what other debate I'm talking about. But that's I think that is a tactic that people use, but it's a tactic people use when they don't have an argument or they know that they're losing the argument. They start to act quite hysterically, shut people down, and accuse them of all sorts, you know, things that are career ending.
I just know that when the film I made, Firefighters Under Occupation, was shown in Rochester in America, they said it was the most complained about film they've ever shown on their film festival. And they showed me some of the news reports they'd got about the film and saying it was totally anti-Semitic, and it was racist, it was anti-Jewish. And they based these reports on nothing, because the film, you can't watch the film publicly, it's not online or anything. So they hadn't watched this film, but they just made all these statements and said I was a racist and an anti-Semite, and but based on nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that film, as you know, a number of times, and how anyone could come to the conclusion. All the film is, if anything, is just a kind of in-depth look at life as a firefighter in Palestine. How anyone could associate it with being anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, utterly nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I did say to the organizer of the film festival in Rochester that if I'd have known in advance, I'd have asked the people who put the complaints in, and actually the organizer of the film festival is Jewish as well. And I said, get the people who put the complaints in and bring them to the festival, and then we could sit down together and watch the film, and then they could stop me at the point it was racist. And I challenge anyone to do that. Still now, if anyone's watching this interview, and I challenge anyone to say that, to try and prove to me anywhere that film is racist.
Yeah. But again, it's just a way of silencing people. Accuse them of being racist, accuse them of being anti-Semitic, accuse them of being, you know, whatever it is. And it either scares people or it shuts them up, or people believe it by default. And that's why, unfortunately, people are a bit more nervous about coming out now. I think we are still quite fortunate in this country in that it's not a big deal. It's not controversial to be Palestine in this country. It's something that you will see across universities, just in general. Whereas I know from my friends who are Americans who I volunteered with in Palestine, very different. It's very different over there. A friend of mine telling me that she was sitting in a bookshop or a cafe reading a Palestinian book, and she had an American woman walk over to her and say, "Are you pro-terrorist?" And you just wouldn't have that in this country. It just, I can't imagine.
It's surprising in America that a lot of politicians and people who are generally fairly progressive and quite liberal in a lot of their views, but when it comes to the Palestinian Israeli conflict or debate or whatever you want to call it, their views are very right wing, and their outlook is very right wing, and they're almost blind to what's happening to the Palestinians.
Yeah, and it's bizarre because there's no way you could look at what's going on there and not see the injustice of it, to see that there is a people who are being oppressed. As much, I'd like to think, even if I was sort of pro-Israel minded, I could still look at what was going on there. And I recall from your film, there was a woman who you interviewed in the film, an Israeli woman, Israeli Jewish woman, who worked for a trade union. I can't remember her name. I think it was
that's it. Yeah. For the history route.
Yes, and I actually met her when I went to Palestine. I kind of spent half a day with her, and she was what I would describe as right wing, pro-Israel right wing. But even she would look at it and say, this, how the Palestinians are being treated is atrocious. It's wrong. Our government are wrong. And I think a lot of these people in Israel can see it and believe that as well, that how the Palestinians are treated is wrong, and they understand the unfairness of it. They just don't really understand how to come to a solution. Whereas people abroad, Americans abroad, can't even see that. They can't even see that there's any oppression going on. Or I take back what I say. They can see it. They just choose to pretend that they don't see it.
Yeah, I think with Americans as well, because of their media system is very one-sided. You tend to see only the stories you want to see, because in America, their TV media, they're not legally obliged to give two sides of the story, whereas in this country they have to at least try. Sometimes we say it's not the BBC, etc. Don't give it even cover stories evenly, but at least they're obliged to try and cover the stories. It was like even in America when I was there, myself and Jim, our mutual friend Jim Malone, we were talking to somebody on a bus. And Jim ended up explaining to this American how the American political system worked, just because they were so badly informed. They had no idea of how their electoral system worked.
I'm just shocked they understood Jim, to be honest.
Yeah, very true, very true. Okay, Lucy, if there's anyone watching this interview who wants to get involved in supporting the Palestinians or wants some more information, or perhaps they may be pro-Israel, or they're not quite sure of where they stand on the issue, where's a good place to get more info on the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
I mean, there's so many resources. The organisation that I volunteer for is ISM, International Solidarity Movement, who are an amazing organisation. Essentially, they act as protective presence in the West Bank and in Gaza. So that's a good source. You've got the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign as well. There's so many resources out there. It's difficult. I'm trying to think of one that would kind of do it from both sides. I can't really think of one. It's one of those subjects. And there's, I like to think I'm quite even-minded with things, but there's a couple of subjects where I'm very, no, this is right, this is wrong. Palestine being one of them. And I think most organizations that deal with this topic, whether they're campaign groups or political organizations or lobby groups or whatever, they are very one way or the other. There's not too many that, you could look at and go, this is quite objective. I would say that's clearly because there is no objectivity you can have about this issue. It's right and wrong. would we listen to someone trying to put forward the positives of apartheid in South Africa during the 80s? No, you wouldn't accept that. And that's exactly what's going on in Palestine now. It's happening in our modern day. Anyone who's based in London, I'm not sure when this is going out, but anyone who's based in London, there's a demonstration tomorrow outside Downing Street at 6 o'clock. And I'm sure there's going to be demonstrations all over the country at the moment in support and showing solidarity to the Palestinians.
Okay, Lucy, it's been great to chat to you this evening. And I'm sure you've helped inform lots of people who are watching this interview. It is when I see the news of the Palestinians I mentioned, I do feel a little bit depressed, because sometimes you almost lose hope, because it does seem like just things are continually getting worse for them. The situation doesn't seem to ever improve, but you got to hope at some point there is a turning point for them.
It can't get any worse, to be fair.
Well, you'd hope
well,
not. Anyway.
I'd say that.
Yeah, but yeah. So if you like the podcast, please subscribe. Please share us on social media. You can find Lucy. You on Twitter, Lucy?
I am. I'm at LuluChops1.
Okay, LuluChops1, and Instagram.
I think LuluChops is what I think.
Okay, well.
Yeah, I think it's LuluChops1 on Instagram as well. But don't be surprised if there's lots of pictures of my brunch and my cat. Yeah,
if you follow Lucy on social media, you'll definitely see some certain parts of the world, because Lucy likes her holidays as well, or used to like her holidays until the pandemic. So, okay, Lucy, thanks for your time. Hope to see you in person sometime in the near future. And good luck with the protest tomorrow evening.
Cheers.
You're listening to Straight to the Point, Uncut.